In order for us to learn the syntax of using... Alright, so first we're just going to create a contact.jsx file. Let me walk you through a couple quick changes that I made before we take what we've just learned and apply it to React. First of all, as you probably already noticed, I took all of our hard-coded instances of our joke components and just moved them outside here and commented them out. Then, where we used to have jokes.md, I created a jokesdata.js file. We're not quite ready to learn how to pull data down from an API and use that data in our React apps. We are going to be doing that in the next section. So for now, we're just going to kind of mimic that. I'm exporting an array of joke objects from this file. This would be kind of similar to the data that we're pulling down from an API. Then all I'm going to do in my app component is import jokes data from that file, and we can see if we console log jokes data, then we do successfully pull in the array of joke objects. Great. So now what I can do with this jokes data is I can create a new array of elements. Let's go ahead and call it maybe joke elements. And I'll set that not equal to an array that I'm going to define with my square brackets here, but instead with the array that gets returned by calling jokesdata.map. .map takes a callback function, so we'll just stub that out for now. And as it iterates over the the array of jokes data, I'm going to have access to each joke in that array. We'll call it a joke object. And that's going to be an object, so this is a joke object. Well, it's not a joke object, it's not a fake object, it's an object that represents the data for a joke. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking this array of regular JavaScript objects, and I'm going to turn them into an array of joke elements. So for each item in my jokes data, I'm going to return a joke component. And then I can pass the data from this JavaScript joke object down through props to my joke component. And by I can do that, I mean you're going to do that. So that's going to be a challenge. Let me type that out. All right, your challenge is to see if you can correctly pass the necessary props to the joke component in the .map and render the joke elements array so that the jokes show up on the page again. You can look down below to see what the structure of our joke components look like, and after you finish passing those props, as it mentions, don't forget to render the joke elements array. That can be kind of a pain to not realize why nothing's showing up. I'll hand it over to you now to work on this challenge. You probably already noticed I took all of our hard-coded instances of our joke components and just moved them outside here and commented them out. Then, where we used to have jokes.md, I created a jokesdata.js file. We're not quite ready to learn how to pull data down from an API and use that data in our React apps. We are going to be doing that in the next section. So for now, we're just going to kind of mimic that. I'm exporting an array of joke objects from this file. This would be kind of similar to the data that we're pulling down from an API. Then all I'm going to do in my app component is import jokes data from that file. And we can see if we console log jokes data, then we do successfully pull in the array of joke objects. Great. So now what I can do with this jokes data is I can create a new array of elements. Let's go ahead and call it joke, maybe joke elements. And I'll set that not equal to to an array that I'm going to define with my square brackets here, but instead with the array that gets returned by calling jokesdata.map. .map takes a callback function, so we'll just stub that out for now. And as it iterates over the array of jokes data, I'm going to have access to each joke in that array. We'll call it a joke object. And that's going to be an object, so this is a joke object. Well, it's not a joke object, it's not a fake object, it's an object that represents the data for a joke. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking this array of regular JavaScript objects, and I'm going to turn them into an array of joke elements. So for each item in my jokes data, I'm going to return a joke component. And then I can pass the data from this JavaScript joke object down through props to my joke component. And by I can do that, I mean you're going to do that. So that's going to be a challenge. Let me type that out. All right, your challenge is to see if you can correctly pass the necessary props to the joke component. Okay. Well, if we look below, we can see that our joke component is able to receive a setup prop and a punchline prop. And if we look at the jokes data that's coming in, we specifically have a property in each object that is called setup and another that's called punchline. So in my JSX, I'm going to include a property called setup, and I'll set it equal to the data that I find inside of my joke object dot setup. I think it's really important to make a distinction at this point. The data that we're pulling in from jokes data, this one has a predefined property called setup. Let's assume I were pulling this down from an API that I don't get to control. I'm sort of beholden to the property name that they chose on their joke objects. If, for example, these weren't called setup, but maybe something like question, then when I'm trying to render this data, I can't use joke.setup just because I thought setup was a better term. I have to use the one that they said, joke.question. In fact, let's just verify that this is working. I'm going to skip ahead and render my joke elements right now. I hope we don't get any errors because we're not passing a punchline. Let's just see what happens. Okay, my punchlines are empty, but my setups are working. So the distinction I think is important to make is that the array of joke data that we're getting in, that array has a question property. I'm going to change this back in a second. But our joke component, which we got to define, we can choose whatever prop name we want to pass in. Because I'm calling it setup inside of my joke component, I'm still going to be using props.setup, whether the data coming in used the phrase setup or not. Just so that we're not getting our terminology crossed or any kind of confusion happening, I'm going to put this back to setup, and then we'll go ahead and change this back to setup. But I remember in the beginning that being a confusing distinction. Just remember that you get to determine what you call your props in the components that you write. And when you're in control of the data, you also get to choose its structure. Very often you'll find that you're not in control of the data and you are stuck with whatever names they chose when they were creating the database. We can hit save and see that our setups are still working. Okay, let's just go ahead and finish this off by adding our punchline prop, and that is going to be equal to joke.punchline. Let's save, and awesome, our jokes are working again. Now we can see if we do a little bit of cleanup, let's get rid of our challenge text and all of this commented out told stuff that we were hard coding before. We can see just how much simpler our code now is because we're pulling in data from an external source, which is oftentimes what you'll find yourself doing. And we can use regular JavaScript methods like the .map method to create an array of joke components and pass that data in. Keep in mind, our code here wouldn't change even if we had 1,000 jokes in our jokes data, unless of course you decided you didn't want to immediately display all 1,000 jokes on the page. Then we'd have a little bit of work to do, pagination or whatever it might be. All right, now we're equipped to go back to our travel journal and not just be stuck with our single Mount Fuji trip, but instead we can take more trips and we can store that data in an external source, in this case just like a JavaScript file, and then iterate over that data to display all of the different entries that we want to display in our travel journal. But before we do that, I do want to give you a little quiz about what we've learned regarding using the map method in our React apps. All right, it's time for another quiz, this time specifically about what we were just learning with .map. Make sure to actually click into the editor and type out your answers, and when you're done you can hit play and we'll go through it together. Okay, number one, what does the .map array method actually do? The .map array method is a vanilla JavaScript array method. It's something that's built into JavaScript and has nothing specific to do with React. And you can run that method on top of any kind of array in JavaScript. You pass to it a callback function. It will iterate over or loop over every item in that array, run the function that you pass to it, and whatever you return from that function, it's going to put in the same index of a new array that gets returned from the .map method. A key part of that is that it returns a new array. And I'll go ahead and kind of summarize what I just said. So it returns a new array, and then whatever gets returned from the callback function provided is placed at the same index in that new array. Usually what we end up doing is taking the items from the original array and modifying them in some kind of way. Okay, question number two, what do we usually use .map for in React? Usually in React, we receive some kind of array of raw data, usually from an API. In our case, we're just stuffing it inside of a JavaScript file and exporting that array, but we receive that raw data and we turn it into JSX elements that can be displayed on the page. Okay, and number three, I don't believe is something we've explicitly talked about, but it would require some critical thinking. Why is using .map better than just creating the components manually by typing them out? Well, I'd say there's a few reasons. First of all, we don't always know what data we're going to have ahead of time. In our case, we know exactly how many jokes we have and what the jokes data says. So we technically could manually type it out. In fact, we did manually type it out. However, in my experience, that's not usually how it works. So I guess answer number one, we could say we often don't have the data ahead of time when we're building our app, so we simply can't manually type them out even if we wanted to. A second reason, though, that I think is maybe a little more important is that by using the .map method, we can make our code a lot more self-sustaining. In other words, if we were to manually type out all of our jokes like we had in the original version, and then our jokes data were to update, we would have to go back to our code and type out new jokes because new jokes got added to the data. However, when we're mapping over the array of data, we are accessing that array directly, which means that if there are new jokes added to the end of this list, simply refreshing the page is going to pull that joke into the app. It will re-render this array, including the new jokes that we added. If instead of adding it here, it, for example, got added to a database that we pulled that data down from an API, all we would need to do is fetch that data, and the new jokes would be included, and our app would render those new items. It's not terribly unlike when we're writing a C-style for loop. Let's say we had let I equal 0, and oftentimes we'll find ourselves looping over the length of an array. So we'll say I is less than some array.length, and then of course I++, and fix this typo here. The reason we're using some array.length is because we don't want to know how long the array is. We just want it to iterate over an entire array, no matter how long that length is. So let me try to summarize this here. Essentially, it makes our code more self-sustaining. It doesn't require additional changes from us, the developer, to change the code whenever the data changes. Great job on this quiz. Hopefully you're able to answer all these questions. Now let's finally get back to our section project and start applying what we've learned. All right, everything that we've worked on so far has come to this point. Before we start, let me just walk you through a couple things really quickly. First of all, instead of having the markdown file that we had before with some of the information, I've created this data.js file. This is exporting an array of objects. Each object represents one entry in our travel journal. I've also added an ID property to each one. Don't worry about that for now. We're going to be talking about that really soon. But for now, you should have all the data that you need. When you import this array, which is part of your challenge, let's see right here, to import that array from data.js, map over that array to create an entry component for every item in that array, and then to render that array of entry components in place of the current entry component. This current entry component is displaying our Mount Fuji right now, but after you've mapped through the array of data and displayed that in place of this one, you should have all three of them showing up. I believe there's actually one really small style change that I want to make. I'm going to add a margin bottom here of 36 pixels just so that they're not shoved up right next to each other. Okay, the time has come. I know that you can do this challenge. It represents a culmination of everything that we've learned so far throughout this section, so it's possible this will be a little bit of a challenge. If you do find that it's way too hard of a challenge for you, then that's a good indication that you should probably pause doing this challenge, go back, revisit some of the lessons and the examples and the practices that we've done throughout this section, practice them again, and reach out to the Scrimba community. If you have any questions at all, head over to Discord. There is always someone from the community online that's willing to help. Okay, I'll hand it over to you. Let me walk you with the array that gets, and I'm going to turn them into an array of joke elements. So for each item in my joke, all right, everything that we've worked on so far has come to this point. Before we start, let me just walk you through a couple things really quickly. Let me walk you through a couple quick changes that I made before we take elements. And I'll set that not equal to an array that I'm going to define with my call it a joke object. And that's going to be an object, so this is a joke object. All right, everything that we've worked on so far has come to this point. Before we start, let me just walk you through a couple things really quickly. First of all, instead of having the markdown file that we had before with some of the information, I've created this data.js file. This is exporting an array of objects. Each object represents one entry in our travel journal. I've also added an ID property to each one. Let me walk you through a couple quick changes that I made before we take what we've just learned now, and as it iterates over the array of just the data for a joke. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking this array of regular Java component, and then I can pass the data from this. Look at the jokes data that's coming in. We specifically have a property in each object that is called setup and another that's called punchline. So in my JSX, I'm going to include a property called setup, and I'll set it equal to the data that I find inside of my joke object dot setup. This down from an API that I don't get to control. Okay, my punchlines are empty, but my setups are working. So the distinction I think is important to make is that the array of joke data that we're getting in, that you write, and when you're in control of the data, you also can. Okay, let's just go ahead and see just how much simpler our code now is. That method to create an array of joke components and pass that data in. Keep in mind, all right, everything that we've worked on so far has come to this. Okay, let's. Okay, let's start by importing our data. We'll just call it data, and we'll get it from the data file. I can get rid of my challenge text. And I'm not sure if I've explicitly covered this or not, but I'm going to be doing the mapping inside of the body of my function, but before my return. It probably would have worked out just fine if you had done it outside of the component, but common practice is to do this as part of the body of the functions. Let's go ahead and start right here by creating a new variable. Let's call it entry elements, since this will represent an array of JSX elements. And I'll set it equal to data.map. So .map again will return a new array, and we want to use our callback function inside here, stub that out. And for every one of the entries, we'll just say it's a single entry. We want to return some JSX. So we'll return, and I'm going to wrap this in a set of parentheses just so I can start this on its own line. We'll go ahead and return an int. Okay, let's start by importing our data. We'll just call it get rid of my challenge. Probably would have worked out just it's entry, and I'm going to wrap this in a set of parentheses just so I can start this on its own line. We'll go ahead and return an instance of my entry component, and we can start taking the data from the entry and putting it into our entry component. Our image is going to equal, I'm going to use a set of curly braces because I have entry.img, and oh, nope, see, I almost made the same mistake. We are actually passing an object into our image, so I want to pass an object. Remember, the first set of curly braces puts me into JavaScript, and the second set represents an object, and I need to pass in a source. So my source is going to be, let's see, entry, that's this entry object, .image.src. Okay, great. And then we have an alt, which we will set to entry.image.alt. Now, this is clearly the longhand way to do this. Because our data does happen to match up, we have an image property, which is an object with an src property and an alt property. I actually can shorten this quite a bit. Instead of repeating each of the properties here, I can simply say my image is going to be entry.image. So I guess the way that I was starting it in the first place was actually going to be right. This might be a little confusing. The entry component is expecting the image prop to be an object, and that object needs to have a source property or an src property and an alt property. And if we go and look at our entry.image, and see right here in data.js, entry.image, it is exactly shaped that way. It's an object with a source property and an alt property. So because our data happens to line up with exactly what our entry component is expecting, then I can just pass in the whole object. This is actually kind of foreshadowing of something else we're going to see soon. Okay, so I also need to pass in a title, and this is going to be entry.title. We'll do country, and I'm just kind of looking down here to see which properties I need. So the country is going to be entry.country. The Google Maps link, entry.Google Maps link. Oh, and I need my curly braces here. Oh, and this is not an object. These are my props, so I need an equal sign. Okay, my dates is going to equal entry.dates, and my text, entry.text. Of course, if I hit save, we're still going to be showing just Mount Fuji, and that's because I haven't yet replaced this. So let's get rid of this entry component, and instead grab our array of JSX elements and stick them right here. So a set of curly braces to go into JavaScript, and then we'll supply our array. This is the moment of truth. Keep your fingers crossed. Let's hit save. And awesome. Look at this. We have all 3 of our entries showing up on our page. The images make it clear that we have different data for each one of the components, but we can look and see each one is unique to its own entry data. Awesome. This is some great progress. And actually, we've covered a majority of what I want to talk about in this whole section of the course. Mapping data in React is one of the most common things you'll find yourself doing. And I personally think it's really neat that React has given us JavaScript primitive ways like the array.map method to accomplish the repetition of our components while passing in unique data to each one. I do have a couple of extra topics that I want to talk about. That's more of a sneak peek into the next section. But I do want to give another soapbox speech that says if this was too big of a struggle for you, first of all, that's completely okay. But second of all, it's a good indication that it's time to go back and restudy this, repractice it until you feel like you could do this from scratch if you needed to. As I said, reach out to the community for help or to simply post a win that you were able to finish, sort of the MVP of our travel journal app. Once you've come down from this high of accomplishing such a great task, Now, this is clearly the longhand way to do this. Because our data does happen to match up, we have an image property, which is an object with an src property and an alt prop shadowing of something else we're going to see soon. Okay, so this is not an object. These are my props, so I need an equal sign. Okay, my dates is going to equal entry.dates, and my text, entry.text. Of course, if I hit save, we're still going to be showing just Mount Fuji, and that's because I haven't yet replaced this. So let's get rid of this entry component and instead grab our array of JSX elements and stick them right here. So a set of curly braces to go into JavaScript, and then we'll supply our array. This is the moment of truth. Keep your fingers crossed. Let's hit save. And awesome. Look at this. We have all 3 of our entries. Okay, let's start by importing our... The coolest part about the way that we've set this up in React is that the display is a function of the data that we're pulling into our app. This just means that if we were to come to our data.js file and let's say just copy and paste these last 3 items, I can hit save, only changing the data, and we come to our app and check it out. We actually have those extra components showing up on our screen. Of course, as I've said, usually we'd be pulling this data in from an API, but that's beside the point at this time. We'll be getting there soon. Let me undo this so we don't have so many of the Geidangerfjord. Hope I'm saying that right. And let's hit save so we just have our 3 items there again. Now, we notice that when we're hitting save, we're getting this warning in the console. And it says that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. And it even tells us where we're rendering that list. And this is a common warning that you'll likely come across many times when you're writing React code, anytime you take an array of data and turn it into an array of components, or an array of React elements. React has an interesting system under the hood that it uses to keep track of what order everything is in when you give it an array of React elements. It's a little bit outside the scope of this course to really discuss why, but from a really high-level overview, if you were to ever include functionality where the user could add new items to this list or maybe remove one of the items from the list, React needs this unique key prop that it talks about in order to keep track of which one you're actually removing or where you're adding new elements. Again, it's a bit outside the scope to get into the nitty-gritty of why, but it's really easy to implement because all we need to do is pass a unique prop called key. And it actually has to be KEY. I know we've talked about how we get to choose the names of our props. Well, this is an exception. It has to be key, and the value that we pass to it has to be unique. So I can't pass, for example, a hard-coded 1 to it because then every one of them would have the same number. And you can see the warning says they encountered 2 children. In this case, it probably should say 3 children with the same key 1. Well, a really common thing for us to do, especially when we're getting data from a database, is that data, or that array of data, will usually have an ID attribute associated with it. And this is actually managed by the database. It ensures that these IDs will be unique across the entire collection in that database, or the entire table of that database. And so if your data does have an ID, in my case I just typed them in manually, then this is the first place to start when it comes to providing a unique key. So I can just say entry.id, hit save, and our warning goes away. Of course, in our case, because we only have 3 entries, I could have used pretty much anything here. The title, dates, text, link to Google Maps, the country, these are all unique across these 3. But of course, if I were to visit another place in Japan and have another entry for Japan, then that clearly is not a good key to use because it would be repeated over multiple elements in the array. Whenever you can, just stick with IDs. While I'm talking about that, if you do happen to have an array that doesn't have an ID, something I often will see beginners do is they will access the index, which is something that .map provides to your callback function if you need it, and then trying to use that index in place of having an actual unique property about your data. And I'll be completely honest with you, this is recommended against, but if I hit save, you can see I'm not getting any kind of warning. In my case, because I'm not going to be adding or removing any of these elements, at least not from the UI itself, the index will kind of get the job done in a pinch. But generally speaking, if you can avoid it, just don't use the index as your key. I'm actually pretty sure there's an entire article on the React docs that talk about this, or at least a section somewhere. So in a pinch, it will work, but whenever you can, use an ID instead. Okay, all the warnings gone, our app is looking good. There's just a few miscellaneous topics that I want to make sure I cover while we're still on the topic of props, so that's what we'll be doing over the next couple scrims. One thing you might have noticed, especially if you were typing this all out from scratch, is that the amount of properties that we're passing to our entry component, it's getting a little bit lengthy. And I'm sure you can imagine if we were to have a lot more data included in each one of these objects, imagine an object that has something like 20 or 30 or more properties to it, it would become way too cumbersome to try and add a new prop for every single one of the properties in that object. One way that we can make this a little bit more concise is by noticing that what we're doing here is creating a prop for image, for example, and passing entry.image, title, entry.title, country, entry.country. Well, it sounds like our entry is interested in every property of the entry object that we're passing to it, which means instead of passing down every property of our entry as a separate prop, what I could do is just create an entry prop and pass the entire object down. Notice that I do need to keep my key here. This is something that's specific to React, as we talked about. So even though I am passing a part of my entry down, I need to tell React that it's got a unique key that it can grab on entry.id. But the rest of the entry object I can pass as a single prop called entry in my case. Of course, I got to choose this name. I could have said something like obj for object or just the word object, but let's keep it as entry. Of course, because I'm changing the props that I'm sending down, if I hit save, sure enough, everything is broken. Gosh, we're not even displaying a single thing. I thought at least some broken links would show up here. So let's go over to entry and have ourselves a little challenge. There it is. Your challenge is to fix our component. I am intentionally being a bit vague here because I want you to think critically and use this as an opportunity to gauge your understanding of props, what's being passed down as props, and how we can make changes to the code of our components so that everything starts working again. I believe in you. I know you've got this. I'll hand it over to you to work on this challenge. tools console. On a Mac, I can hit Command-Option-J and it will open those directly. But I can see down here in the console, it says that it cannot read properties of undefined reading source. And that makes sense because before we were receiving an IMG prop, which was an object that had a source property, but we're no longer receiving IMG, which means this is undefined, and we get an error trying to read the .source property on top of the undefined value in JavaScript. If I want to temporarily bypass this error, I can use optional chaining, and I think this will, so this shows some elements at least showing up on my screen. We can clearly see that things are broken, so this will give me a chance to console log the props, which is always a good place to start when you're debugging something. Okay, and sure enough, if we look really closely, it's a bit of a mess when it's all in line, but we can see that we're receiving a single property called entry, and that entry prop has a value of an object where all of the other data is being stored, which means all I really need to do is everywhere I have props dot, go ahead and select everything on the page. All I need to do is add an entry in front of that, and then access the properties of that entry as it's nested inside. Let's clean up this console log. I'm actually going to remove my optional chaining there, and we'll go ahead and hit save. And awesome, we're working again. Now, although everything is working, I think it's helpful to notice at this point that the reason we're magically working is because the data that we have inside of our data array matches exactly, in terms of the language or the property names that we're using, matches exactly with what our entry is expecting. As a reminder, if we were to change what properties we were passing down, then we would have to make a change here to reflect how the data looks. Because we're passing this entire object down, we're now essentially stuck using the exact property names that are here. Sometimes when you're dealing with an API, you might have something that isn't truly conventional JavaScript, like you might be pulling in something that says Google Maps link, but with snake case instead of camel case. I'll go ahead and hit save, and we can see now that Mount Fuji, at least in the display, we no longer have an underline under view on Google Maps. And that's because the object that we're passing down expects it to say Google_Maps_link. In our entry, we're not doing that. Let's see, where's our link source? Right here. We're still using camel casing. So just something to keep in mind, when you are passing down entire objects, you will be stuck using whatever properties they give you. Let's go ahead and change this back. Again, hit save, and now our link is working again. So there's certainly trade-offs. One really nice thing is that we just have a single prop here. We're passing the entire object down, and if you really don't like the way that the data is structured, or rather the way that the property names are set up, there are ways that you can rename them just for the sake of your own code. But we won't be worrying too much about that right now. All right, we are so close to done. There is one little thing that I wanted to show you regarding exactly what we have here. It's another relatively concise way that we can pass down all of the properties of our entry item here, and it does look a little bit unique, so I wanted to make sure I covered it just so that you weren't super confused by it if you did see it in the wild. So that's what we'll be touching on next.
hit save, and awesome, we're working again. Now, although everything is working, I think it's helpful to notice at this point well, if we open our console, and something that can be helpful on Scrimba is to open your actual browser developer tools console on a... There's one last little syntactic trick that you can use when you're passing a full object down through props. And I wanted to touch on it just in case you did see it in the wild, because the syntax looks a little bit confusing. The trick uses the JavaScript object spread notation, but instead of spreading the object itself, this is our entry object that we're pulling from our data, instead of spreading the object itself like this, what we actually can do is remove our prop entirely, put a set of curly braces, and spread in our entry object. React will look at this, and it will take all of the individual properties of our entry object and create a new prop that matches each of the properties of this entry object. So essentially, it would see that our data has an ID property, an image property, a title property, and let's just start with those because that's all I can remember offhand. And it would be essentially like doing exactly what we had before, where we say ID equals entry.id, image equals entry.image. And remember, image in this case is an object, that's totally okay. And title equals entry.title, and so on and so forth until it covered every single one of the properties of our entry object. Let me put this back to use this new spread syntax that we see here. But of course, we just went through changing this so that it passed down an entry object through props, and we have props.entry.everything. So if I go ahead and hit save, then we can see we're completely broken. And I considered having you do a challenge to do this, but I just made you do this work. So I'm going to go ahead and do this for you. Everywhere I have entry dot, I'm just going to multiple select and we'll delete that. So essentially, this is back to exactly the way we had it. I'll hit save, and awesome, everything is working again. In some ways, this is kind of like the best of both worlds. You don't have quite as much clutter here by having to say props.entry.image.source and so forth throughout the code of this component. And on the other side of the equation, over here, we get to simply say curly braces, ... entry. So this is more concise, and this is more concise. However, in certain circumstances, I find myself personally struggling with this method only because it really obscures what data is coming down through this entry object. In my case, I have to go all the way to my entry component and console log my props just to see what data is coming in. If I were to make alterations to this, like say I had a new property in that entry object that I needed to display somewhere, I'd have to make sure I understood exactly what was coming through. I guess it's really not that big of a deal when I say it out loud, but for the sake of this course, I'm going to leave this here for this scrim. But going forward, I'm likely either going to create a separate prop for each of the data points that I want to pass down, or I'm going to pass down an entire object and just kind of live with the more verbose syntax that we have to have here on the component side of the equation. And all right, folks, that marks the end of our travel journal. I'm sure there's lots of improvements that you could make to it. I would love to see them if you want to make your own design changes, or more interestingly, I'd love to see what places you have visited. Fortunately, all you have to do is go to data.js because of the way we structure this and make changes directly to the data. Hit save, and your own information will show up here. Head over to the Discord, post a screenshot of some of the cool places that you visited, or if you don't feel like going in that depth, just post a screenshot of your progress here with the travel journal. The Scrimba Discord community is one of the most welcoming places ever. The last thing we have to do is do a quick recap of everything that we've learned throughout this section, and if you're a Scrimba Pro member, we'll be giving you a solo project that you can work on that will be in a similar scope to what we've worked on in our section project with the travel journal, and we'll give you an opportunity to really test and push yourself to see if you're able to recreate something similar to this from scratch. If you're not yet a Scrimba Pro member, I highly recommend testing it out and trying one of these solo projects, because they make all the difference in not only this React course, but the Scrimba front-end career path in general. What a great job you've done on the travel journal project. I hope that it's been an inspiration to you to get out there and do a little bit more traveling too. What we've learned in this section has enabled us to build some pretty cool stuff. We started out by talking about why reusability is important in the first place. We saw that probably most of the websites that we visit have some component of reusability that is driven by its data as opposed to just being hard-coded by a developer somewhere. There will likely always be static portions of whatever web page you'll build, but more often than not, you will find yourself using data to drive the content of your website or your web app. And we learned in React a primary way of being able to reuse our components is by providing props. Just like how functions have parameters that give that function the ability to be reused with any kind of data that's passed to it, props give React components that same power. And we learned how React can render an array of components, which allowed us to create an array of components from a raw array of data. In our case, we had our data just directly in our project, but more often than not, you would find yourself calling out to some kind of API to get that data, map over it, and then display that data to the page. This marks a giant step forward in our understanding of React and also the level of cool projects that we can build with it. So this would be a perfect time to head over to the Scrimba Discord community and post your accomplishment in the Today I Did channel. Go there to celebrate your own wins as well as congratulate others on the wins that they've been having recently too. Once you've had a chance to do that, this might be a good time to take a break because what's coming up is a really meaty section. The topics we are about to cover will really step up your React game and empower you to create truly amazing interactive web apps with React. Once you've had a chance to celebrate your wins and rest your brain a little bit, we'll dive right into that in the next section. You have done an amazing job so far in this course, and now we are finally approaching probably the most exciting section in this course, which is building interactive web apps in React. I am so excited because this section really unlocks a huge section of React that allows us to create really dynamic, exciting web applications. What we've been working on so far is first learning the fundamental building blocks of React by building static websites. This was really important for us because we needed to learn the syntax of creating our own components and generally, of course, how to spin up a React app from scratch, how React is even working behind the scenes and what its main philosophy is. Then we moved on to how we could build reusable components. We learned about props and how we can pass data into those components. This allowed us to use static data to generate portions of our web page, which is what set up the foundation for what we are about to learn. And I've done my best to make these sections really exciting, and hopefully you weren't like our grumpy friend Stanley here, bored out of your mind while learning these topics. Now, the crux of what we are about to start learning lies in understanding the difference between static web pages and dynamic web apps. We've been mostly working with static web pages in React so far, and you can tell something is a static web page based on the fact that it is usually read-only. In other words, there's no user-driven changes to the data behind the scenes. Some really common examples that come to mind of this are blogs. When I'm visiting a blog, I'm usually just consuming or reading the content on the blog. Now, there might be tiny interactive elements on most blogs these days, but I think you get the idea that's not the portion of the site I'm talking about. The same goes for news sites. It's presented to us, we consume the information in a read-only way, but we're not updating the news that's written on the news site. Recipes are another good example of this, and I'm sure we could come up with many more. We are totally capable of building the front ends of these kinds of websites in React. However, what we are about to venture into is understanding how we can build dynamic web apps in React. You could classify something as a dynamic web app when it has read and write capabilities, or the user has ability to change the data. As such, these kinds of dynamic web apps tend to be highly interactive. Typically, these kinds of apps will have portions of the site that will display your data specific to you as the user of this app. Some examples that come to mind are a bank website. You log into your bank website, it displays your information, your account balances, allows you to transfer actual money, or at least the ones and zeros that represent money, and so forth. Also, pretty much any SaaS product or service like Airbnb, there's portions of their site that will display static information to you, like a list of properties, but you have the ability to filter through them and organize them by price or rating. You can click into them, and maybe most interactively, you can book the Airbnb and pay for it. This kind of leads into a whole section of sites that are e-commerce sites. The ability to add items to your cart and purchase it with your money are telltale signs of a dynamic web app. And these days, I'm sure if you were to look around, you would find probably hundreds of different web apps that you have signed up for and at least used in the past. To guide our curriculum through this section, we are going to be making a really exciting web app called Chef Claude. Chef Claude is a recipe app where you will input a list of ingredients that you have on hand, and at the click of a button, send that list of ingredients off to an AI API to generate a recipe for you based on your ingredients. And this project is actually going to have two options for different AIs you can use, one using Claude AI through the Anthropic API, and another using Mistral AI, which we will access through the Hugging Face API. Boy, that was a lot of acronyms. This project is super exciting. It's actually something I find myself using, and it's going to help us really grasp all of the concepts from this section in creating dynamic web apps with React. So without further ado, let's dive in and start learning. Sometimes when I'm starting a new project that might feel a little bit overwhelming, I try to find parts of the project that I already do know how to build. Up until now, we've only been building static pages in React, and the truth You have done an amazing job so far in this course, and now we are finally approaching probably the most exciting section in this course, which is building. Sometimes when I'm starting a new project that might feel a little bit overwhelming, I try to find parts of the project that I already do know how to build. Up until now, we've only been building static pages in React, and the truth is, there are parts of this app that are completely static. So I'm going to give you a challenge now to create this header section. It's mostly just meant as, I guess, both a continuation of the previous section to make sure we're still practicing, and as a way just to warm us up for learning all about how we can make this app a really nice interactive app by the end of this section. So your challenge is to start by building the header components. You're going to do it in a separate file and then render it here in the app component. If you click on the screenshot here, it will take you to the Figma design file, and there's a couple things that I'm setting you up with just because it's a little more tricky. First of all, I've already included the chef Claude icon.png file. That's the little robot with the chef's hat here in the logo. So inside of your header components, you can import that, as we've seen with handling static assets. You can import it and then render it as the source for this image element. In the CSS, I've also put a little bit of starter CSS here. Maybe most interestingly, I've set the font family to Inter already, which is being imported in our HTML file, so you don't have to worry too much about going to Google Fonts and grabbing that. Also, Figma has recently changed where it has obscured a little bit some of the CSS rules that you might need, and one that I found a little bit challenging was the box shadow that it has underneath the header. Right here, there's a tiny little box shadow that helps separate it from the rest of the body, and although it's a small detail, it actually makes a pretty big visual difference. And so the code for it is right here. Just feel free to copy and paste this into the box shadow of your header. Also, keep in mind the design on Figma, it is a little bit more optimized for a bit of a wider screen. If you want, you can follow exactly the sizing and just pull your mini browser a bit wider, or there's the feature where you can maximize it to show up bigger inside of the Scrimba window. Either way is totally fine. If you do decide to keep this a little bit on the smaller side, which is what I'm going to do, I'm probably going to change a couple of the values that are in Figma just to make it fit better on the mini browser. The changes are minor, it's not that important to our learning, so feel free to do it however makes the most sense for you. Okay, it's your time to shine. Go ahead and get started on building the header component.
And see, we'll just call it header.jsx. It'll be its own file in this a little bit backwards and pretend that we have already built a header component that I can import and render here. So let's go ahead and see, we'll just call it header.jsx. It'll be its own file in the same folder as the app component because we have a relatively small scoped project. A little bit backwards and pretend that we have already built a header component that I can import and render here. So let's go ahead and see, we'll just call it header.jsx. It'll be its own file in the same folder as the app component. Because we have a relatively small scoped project, I'm not going to worry at this point about creating a separate components folder or making a really deeply nested structure in our project. So we'll just keep it like this. If we need to, we can always refactor later. And then right here, I'll go ahead and render my capital H header component. And I'm not going to hit save because we'll crash because this doesn't exist yet. So let's create that file header, capital H header.jsx. And there it is. We'll create our function. We'll export default function header. And we'll do a little sanity check here. We'll say we have an H1 that will return that just says header component here. Hit save, and sure enough, it's showing up. Awesome. Let's get the content on the page, and then we'll worry about styling it. So I am going to use a semantic HTML header element.
And we have a very simple header. Often with real businesses, just to make sure everything stays exactly as their brand needs it to be, the logo or the icon and the text will all actually just be a single image. In my case, what we have exported is just this little chef logo. So we will need to put some text there. So we'll render an image and we'll render, I guess we can call it an H1. It's kind of like the site header. Again, usually this is part of an image, so that's not what we would dedicate our H1 to, but I think we'll be okay. So we'll say this is Chef Cloud and the source is going to be equal to the icon. I could in Scrimba give a path to the icon and say /images/chefcloudicon.png, and I think that should work. Yep, there's our icon. Better practice though, as we've discussed, is to import any static assets. So I'm going to grab, let's see, this text here. We'll import it and call it the Chef Cloud logo, and we'll import it from that icon or that path to the PNG. And our function will export default function header about styling it. So Chef Cloud, and the source is going to import any static exactly what the header and the body is. Let me enter as well. The design shows that there's about an 11 pixel gap between the icon and the text. We're going to make this icon smaller in just a second. Let's see, I'm having trouble seeing exactly what the header and the body is. Let me just temporarily give this a crazy background color. We'll say the background color is red. Okay, that's pretty good. The height seems a little bit large to me. It looks like in the design it's set to 108 pixels. Oh, that's even larger. Let's go ahead and use our discretion to change this to something different. 80 pixels seems a little more reasonable, and then we can go ahead and fix our image. And oh, let's grab this box shadow code while we're here and stick it there. Change the background color away from red. We'll get rid of that line. I think I'll look ahead a little bit and change the background color of my body to the background color that is in the design. And wow, that is very subtle. And oh, it looks like it also is coloring the header, so we'll need to specify that this needs to stay white. So this will be a background color of white. And yeah, that's working. Perfect. Okay, let's get access to our image. Because I'm only going to have one header and it's only going to have one image, I'll just select those directly as a descendant, or I'll select the image as a descendant of the header. I think that won't be a problem, but we can always add classes if we need a little more specificity. The width on this, I think it says it's 40 something. Let's see what it looks like as a 50 pixel width for now. And then I will do the same, selecting my H1 inside my header. In the design, it has the font size set to 32 pixels, which is 2 rem. And I think that might be the default size for an H1, so I don't think I actually need that. Let's try the font weight. It shows as 400, and yes, that does make a difference, and it looks a little more sleek, being not quite as bold, so let's keep it like that. Sometimes we get issues with default margins, but it looks like that's not causing a problem here, so I don't even need to say margin 0. We've already got the font family set to enter. Let's comment this out and make sure that's working. It's subtle, but it's working. So I guess that's it. We've got our header all set up. I know it's a lot to spend this much time doing CSS in the middle of a course on React. I really do try my best to integrate some of the past lessons that you've had, especially here on Scrimba if you're taking the front-end developer career path, just so things don't get stale. You know what I mean? It's better to practice it now, even though it's not technically what we're learning. And as I've mentioned before, you do have my permission to skip some of the CSS that we do if it's something you already feel completely familiar and comfortable with. Okay, so we finished this top section, and although we are going to add some interactivity to our tiny little form here, the structure of the form, just being an input and a button, as well as the looks of it, can be started as static. So we're going to do that next before we move on to more of the meat of the section. Welcome to section 4 and the last section where we'll be focusing on learning new things in React in this course. This entire section is all about how we can handle side effects in React. And in the years that I've been teaching React, I have found that understanding side effects in React can be one of the more tricky things that even seasoned React developers can experience. When React transitioned away from class components into functional components and started using hooks back in version 16.3, the way that the world thought about React kind of changed forever. There wasn't nearly as much talk about side effects in React as there is these days, which once you understand the concept of side effects, actually turns out to be a good thing. Let's take a quick look into what we'll be learning in this section. We've already learned about the new way that React handles forms, with form actions and some other APIs that are a bit outside the scope of this course. However, there are instances where you may still want to do forms. In the way that they used to be done in React, which is using controlled components. The app that we'll be building in this section, which we're going to talk about in a second, uses controlled components, and so I figured this would be a good opportunity to cover that topic. Then we'll be taking a bit of a studious aside to talk about functional programming and how the React philosophy has really centered around functional programming. This will give us a better understanding of the concept of side effects and how we can best think about them in React. Then on a more practical level, we are going to be creating a side effect so that we can fetch some data. There's a lot of different ways to deal with fetching data, but we will be seeing how we can fetch some data as soon as our app loads. Then for the majority of the section, we will specifically be talking about side effects, what they are, how we can create them in React, what pitfalls we need to be on the lookout for, and so forth. And of course, this wouldn't be Scrimba if there weren't a ton of hands-on challenges along the way. Speaking of which, to drive this curriculum forward, we are going to be building a meme generator. It's a pretty straightforward app. It has an input for top text, so when you type into this top text input box, on every keystroke, the text on the meme image will update. And then of course the same for the bottom text. When you type into this input, the bottom text will update on every keystroke. And then you have the option to click a button, which will get a new random meme image from a list of popular meme images that comes from the meme API called ImageFlip. We'll also have a quick chance to apply the concepts that we learned in this section to add a feature to our Chef Claude app from the last section. So no more delay, let's jump right in. To help us guide our discussion about side effects, we are going to be following this meme generator project. And unlike the previous projects where I actually have us start it completely from scratch, we are going to be beginning this one from a starting point. So before I just threw you into an unfamiliar code base, I wanted to walk through the code here and give you a chance to walk through it yourself. I think it's helpful to have somebody explain the code, but I think it's even more helpful to take the time to go through things on your own and maybe even try to change things. Fortunately, the starting point for this app is really straightforward. We can start over here in our index. We're just creating a root and rendering the app component. The app component is simply importing the header and main components and rendering those. The header is simply this purple header up top, and the main is, well, everything else on the page. The header is as simple as it might seem, and the main is currently not doing anything React-y other than simply rendering the JSX. You can see we're hard coding the image, the top text, and the bottom text. The one thing that is a little bit different about this, and we're going to be talking about this soon, is how the inputs kind of look like they belong to a form, and the button kind of looks like it submits that form. But the truth is, that's not exactly how this one works. The user will simply type into the top text input box, and that will, every keystroke, update the text that displays on the image. Up at the top, of course, the bottom text does the same for the bottom, and clicking the button doesn't submit any form anywhere, it just randomly gets a new meme image. This project will be a little bit on the simple side. I know a lot of memes these days have text in different positions than just the top and bottom, but we're not going to get that deep into it. As I said, everything is just hard-coded right now. In the next lesson, we're going to be moving this into React State, and then we'll jump into building this project, and the main reason we're doing this project is learning how we can make fetch requests to an API as soon as our app loads. Before I just jump into the next lesson, I'm going to put a pause in here to give you a chance to look through this code, make sure you understand what's going on. Again, it's not terribly complicated, it's kind of just like walking through some HTML, but doing so should hopefully prime you to have success through the rest of this project. So take some time now to peruse through the code. All right, hopefully that was helpful. In the next lesson, we are going to move some of this information into state. All right, let's get started right off with a challenge. I want you to move the hard-coded meme information that we have down here into React state. The state should contain an object that has a top text, bottom text, and image properties, and then set the initial values of those properties to the values that you see below. In fact, you know what? I'm going to make a change here just so that it's clear. This is an image URL. At this point, we're not going to worry about hooking up the inputs or the button, so you're just simply creating state and using that state value instead of the hard-coded ones down below. Go ahead and get started on this challenge. In this section to add a feature to our Chef Claude app from the last section. So no more delay, let's jump right in. To help us guide our discussion about side effects, we are going to be following this meme generator project. And unlike the previous projects where I actually have us start it completely from scratch, we are going to be beginning this one from... All right, let's get started right off with a challenge. I want you to move the hard-coded meme information that we have down here into React state. The state should contain an object that has a top text, bottom text, and image properties, and then set the initial values of those properties. All right, let's go ahead and create, let's call it meme and set meme, and this will be equal to react.useState. And I need to, before I forget anything else, import React from React. And actually, you know what? We've had 3 sections where we're importing the entire React library, and I mentioned specifically that it makes it a little bit easier to know that useState is coming from the React library, but I think you probably get it for now, so I'm just going to switch it up. We're going to destructure useState and pull that in from the React library, and then just call it useState like this. Honestly, this is probably the more common way that you'll see it, so I think it'll be good to see it both ways. All right, my initial state is going to be an object, as it mentions down here, and we're going to have a top text property, a bottom text property. I'm just setting these equal to empty strings for now. We're going to fix this in a second, and then an image URL property. Okay, for the top text, we have one does not simply, and right there. Bottom text, walk into Mordor, and let's grab this image URL as our starting point here, clean up the challenge text, and we need to switch these to now use the state value instead. So this is going to be meme.imageURL. This one is meme.toptext and meme.bottomtext. These kinds of refactors are not super thrilling because I will hit save and it essentially looks like I didn't do any work. But we've primed ourselves to now be able to update our state, which will of course update the UI. This whole section is about side effects and using a built-in function from React called useEffect, but I kind of want to take care of some of the other items that we have. For example, being able to type into these inputs and have them on every keystroke update our text. So I guess we have, pun intended, a little bit of an aside to take before we get into side effects. So in the next lesson, let's hook up these inputs so that they can update our state. In the last section, we learned all about forms and how we can add an action property to our forms in order to catch the information whenever that form gets submitted. I mentioned at the time that that represents an update to React. This is Sometimes when I'm starting a new project that might feel a little bit overwhelming, I try to find parts of the project that I already do know how to build. Up until now, we've only been building static pages in React, and the truth is there are parts of this app that are completely static. When our users first come to the Chef Cloud app, they're just going to see the header and this little form here. We might decide to add a little blurb that explains what this app is supposed to do, but for now, the only other static thing that we need to really worry about is creating this form. It will, of course, have some interactivity with it, and we're going to learn all about how we can deal with forms in React a bit later in this section. But for now, let's go ahead and get this form added. Now, I have made you do a lot of this manual work. I know that it's just repetitive CSS work mostly, and so I'm going to give you a little treat. I'm going to work through this. I will keep it here in the recording, and it will be the remainder of this lesson. So if you're interested to see how I create and design this little form, then by all means stick around. If you're ready to move on from the static stuff, we're about to jump into some really exciting things, so that can be what you do next. So you're welcome to skip ahead to that if you want. I'm going to get started first. Let's head to our app, and underneath our header, I'm going to include another component called main. Now I need to wrap this in something because we can't render two sibling elements like that in React. I need to import main from /main, and then of course I need to create that. So we'll create a new file called main.jsx and spin up our component. As I usually like to do, I'll just return something simple to make sure things are hooked up. Okay, great, we're showing main component there. The content that we're concerned about at this point is very simple. We are going to probably be doing most of our markup here inside of the main component, but for now we can just create our form. And so first, because this is the main section of our app, we're going to surround it in the semantic main element, and then we'll add a form. I know this is just a simple single input and a button, but even stuff like this, I much prefer to put in a form. First of all, it's more semantically correct. We are creating a form here. It makes it better for assistive technologies to understand what's going on. We also get some built-in functionality when we put it inside of a form. For example, when a user fills the input out and then hits the enter button, it will automatically submit the form. It will have access to the form data if we need it, and just a whole host of benefits by using an actual HTML form. Okay, so in the design, we just have an input and a button. Typically, for accessibility reasons, we would want to make sure we also include a label, or another option that we can do is to add an ARIA attribute to our input that's called ARIA label. And so I'll set that equal to add ingredient, so that anybody using a screen reader can very easily understand what they're supposed to do with this input. Okay, let's put this on its own line because we're going to add some extra properties here. We want this to be a type of text. We'll give it a placeholder, just like we saw in the design. We can say something like, for example, oregano. As a reminder, a placeholder is a great place to put an example of what should be entered as text into that field, and it isn't a great place to put the actual label, so I wouldn't want to say something like add ingredient as my placeholder. Okay, by default forms are pretty ugly, so let's hit refresh, and yeah, our button has no text. We might want to say add ingredient there. Okay, let's see what we're working with. Perfect. Well, not quite perfect yet. Let's go ahead and style it up. Chances are I'm not going to be adding any more forms to this page, so I could just select the form element, but I'm not sure why. I'm feeling like I probably want to give this a class name, so I'm going to give it a class name of add ingredient form. Okay, I'll hit save so that applies. We'll go over to the CSS and start styling this. Let's access our add ingredient form, and I'm going to add a display of flex, even though we do already have inline elements, just so that it makes it a bit easier for me to center things. So I can justify content center. We'll add a gap of about 12 pixels, I think the design shows, and it's sitting right against the header. So let me also add some padding to the main element. We'll give it maybe 10 on the top and bottom and 30 on the left and right. And I guess I need to specify padding. And oh, when I did that, I see that my elements are stretching now. That's a default with display flex. So if I were to instead say align item center, that should fix that issue. Of course, our button is a little large. You know what? I'm going to cheat and just make this a little bit wider. I should probably add some kind of no wrap rule to the button, but for now, I'm not going to worry about it. Okay, let's access our input. I'm going to grab the style for my form and then specify the input on it. And let's give it some border radius of about 6 pixels. The default border is a little bit crazy, so we will add our own border styles of 1 pixel solid. And then I'm just going to grab this color from the design. Okay, that looks much better. The padding is a bit tight there, so we'll add a padding of about 9 pixels on the top and bottom and 13 on the left and right. Awesome, looking good. We can make this a little bit wider so add ingredient doesn't wrap again. The design does have a little bit of a box shadow around it, so I'm just going to paste that in from my dev mode in Figma, which you likely don't have access to for this design. And then one thing I noticed from the design is the input does get pretty wide as the screen gets wider, so I do want it to grow. I can use the flex grow property. We'll just set it to 1 so that as the screen expands, it does get wider. Although I do think I want to add a minimum and a maximum because it can get a little bit squishy right down there and a little bit too wide way out here. So let's give this a min width of, let's say, 150 pixels and a max width of maybe about 400 pixels. So as we get wider, it should stop growing. Yeah, perfect. Okay, the input is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and style our button, and then we can move on. So we'll access the button, and for whatever reason, I'm sure there's a good reason for it, but buttons do not take on the font family that's specified elsewhere, even if you specify it in the body here. So I'm going to make sure I specify the enter font family for our button. We'll also give it a border radius of 6 pixels, just like our input. The border is looking a bit intense, so I think for now I'm just going to say border none on the button. Let's give it a background color. And this is a color specified in the design. Of course, the text is now impossible to read, so we will specify the font color with the color rule. All right, that's looking a little better. And the button is pretty squatty. I could try to add padding to it, although I don't really want to add padding and try to guess to make it the exact same height as my input. Maybe what we can do is take away the align item center. And well, actually, that just kind of makes it work. It just makes it look better. It's using the default of stretch as its align items, and that actually looks pretty good. I'm not sure that this will make much of a difference, but I'm going to specify a height on my whole form. The design looks like the input is 38 pixels tall, so we'll just add that. It doesn't look like it's making a change, but maybe any other structural changes that we make make that height might be good, or maybe it'll be bad and we get rid of it. For now, let's leave it in. Now, the design does show this little plus icon on the button before the add ingredient. And I could just go in and type that into the markup, but it feels almost decorative to me. So I think what I'm going to do instead is use a before pseudo selector and just say that the content is a plus, and then maybe give it a little bit of margin right, just to separate it a little bit. And I need my semicolon here. And actually our button is still looking a little bit squished. So let's see if maybe we give it a width of 150 pixels. I think the design shows quite a bit more. Oh, and I think the font size is a little bit smaller. The font size looks like it's set to 14 pixels, which comes out to 0.875 rem. And oh yeah, that makes a big difference. It also looks from the design that the font weight might be adjusted. Looks like it's set to 500. Let's see if that's making a difference. Oh, it's a very slight difference, but we'll go ahead and leave it in. Oh, and one last thing, I'm noticing that our form is shoved up pretty close to our header. It looks like in the design there's about a 70 pixel space between those. I think that's going to be a little bit large for such a small site here. So I'm going to call an audible, and let's see, our padding on our main element is 10 on the top and bottom, 30 on the left and right. I'm going to go ahead and specify, let's see, 10 pixels for the bottom, and then change this to, yeah, let's say 30 pixels on the top. This is a little bit less common. If you have just 3 values, then it's top, left and right, and bottom. Kind of a weird way. I'm honestly not sure how I remember that, but it's working great. Okay, we're done with the static portions of our page. We have a lot to dive into still. I think a really good idea is for us to take a step back and get a high-level overview of the project and make sure that we understand how we're going to go about building it. That'll be something we do really quickly in the next scrim. When our users first come to the Chef Cloud app, they're just going to see the header and this little form here. We might decide to add a little blurb that explains what this app is supposed to do, but for now, other than just building the static parts of your page, it's a really good idea when you're starting a new project like this to try and take a step back and think about how you would approach solving the problem. Assuming you're fairly new to React, that might not be entirely possible at this point because you still have quite a bit left to learn, but I thought it would be helpful for us to get a high-level overview of how we're going to approach building this project. When the user first shows up, as I've mentioned, they will simply see our header and a little form like this where they can start adding ingredients. Once they start adding ingredients, we're going to change the layout of the page a little bit. We'll include this header that says ingredients on hand. We're going to map over the array of ingredients that they've entered into the form, and we're going to have a call to action down here where they can click this Get a Recipe button. This is where things get pretty fun. Clicking the Get a Recipe button will send the list of ingredients embedded in a prompt that we send to the Claude API from Anthropic. Claude is an extremely capable text completion AI that will take the prompt we send to it, which will include the list of ingredients, and it's going to generate a recipe. Now, on this next screen, I had to split it because we're going to be scrolling up and down the page, but you can see it will have a suggested recipe. It's going to have a basic text at the top that tells you what it recommends that you make, and then it will have a formatted list of ingredients and a formatted list of instructions. The way we're going to handle this formatting is fairly simple, but it's not something we have to be too concerned about right now. Now, there's still a lot left we have yet to learn, so don't let all of this feel like it's too overwhelming. I promise we're going to take it one step at a time, and by the end of this section, you are going to be able to complete this entire project from scratch if you needed to. All right, I'm too excited to wait any longer. Let's jump in. The primary thing that sets apart a static website from a web application is the user's ability to interact with the things that they see on the screen. And one of the primary ways that we do that is by listening for events. So let's talk about how we can add event listeners to our components in React. First of all, based on the prerequisites for this course, I expect that you already are familiar with the concept of adding an event listener in regular DOM JavaScript, where you would select some element and you would use the .addEventListener method. This method takes 2 parameters. The first one is the type of event that you want to listen for, like a click event, and the second is a function that should run should the click event ever happen on this specific element. Another way that you can add event listeners to elements is directly from the HTML. If, for example, I wanted to, well, let's say we have a button here, and it'll just say trigger event. Inside the HTML, I can add an attribute to my button called onClick, all lowercase like this, and set it equal to the string of a function that exists in my JavaScript file, maybe called handleClick. And I use a set of parentheses here to indicate that I want to run that function when the onClick is triggered, or rather when the click event happens. And although I seem to find this HTML method of adding event listeners a little more rare than using the addEventListener method in JavaScript, the way that we're going to do this in React is actually more similar to the way that we see it here. The syntax is very similar to how we do it in HTML. So let's go to our JavaScript. I'll get rid of this line here. And the way that we can add an event listener is one of the properties that we pass to this button. So I can add an onClick, but this time I'm going to use a capital C. As a reminder, sometimes it's easy to forget that we're actually inside the JavaScript file, even though what we're writing looks a lot like HTML, and this JSX code that we have will be converted into a regular JavaScript object. That JavaScript object will then, by React, be turned into an actual DOM node that displays on the page. But because we're here in JSX, any of the attributes that we add to our React elements are going to be accessing the actual DOM node's attributes or properties, and in JavaScript that accesses the document object model, it does use camel casing like this. That's the same reason that we're using class name, because class name is the actual DOM node property. Now, because we are here in JavaScript, I don't need to set this equal to a string of a function that I'm trying to run. Instead, I can set it to the actual JavaScript expression that I want to run, which means if I want to, I can just stick a function right here in line, and whatever I'm going to run here, let's say console log clicked, the body of this function will run anytime a click event happens on this button. Let me hit save, and oh, we have our trigger event button. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. Okay, so if I hit click me, then we get the JavaScript that we put inside of our function actually running on the click event. Now, I don't personally love to put my functions right here in line. Sometimes I'll find myself doing it. More often than not, I will create a function outside at the top level of my component above the return. And so I might have something like function handle click, and we'll go ahead and just put our console log back. And this leads us to our first challenge. Your challenge is to add the new function that we just created, handle click, to the button. Go ahead and give this one a shot. because class name is the actual DOM node property. Now, because we are here in JavaScript, I don't need to set this equal to a string of a function that I'm trying to run. Instead, I can set it to the actual JavaScript expression that I want to run, which means if I want to, I can just stick a function right here in line, and whatever I'm going to run here, let's say console log clicked, the body of this function will run anytime a click event happens on this button. Let me hit save, and oh, we have our trigger event button. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. Okay, so if I hit click me, then we get the JavaScript that we put inside of our function actually running on the click event. Now, I don't personally love to put my functions right here in line. Sometimes I'll find myself doing it. More often than not, I will create a function outside at the top level of my component above the return. And so I might have something like function handle click, and we'll go ahead and just put our console. Now, some of you might have been a little bit tricked by adding handle click followed by a set of parentheses. I had mentioned that this is the way that we do it inside of our HTML. However, because we're here in JavaScript, if I include the set of parentheses, it's going to run this function as soon as the component loads or is rendered. Let me go ahead and hit save and watch the bottom of your screen for the console, and you'll see it immediately ran I was clicked, even though I didn't actually click the button. We don't want to include the set of parentheses here because that does indicate that we want to run the function immediately, as opposed to passing the contents of the function or the functionality of the function to the button element so that it will only run when the click event is triggered. So I'll go ahead and hit save, and now it will run I was clicked when I click the click me button. Awesome. Before I get too much further, I do want to point you towards the documentation on responding to events. Click the screenshot if you want to head to the React documentation for this. And I also included a slide that leads you to the mouse event handler functions, which give you an example of different mouse events that you can respond to in React. And this documentation is going to be helpful for you for the next challenge. All right, your next challenge is to log something to the console whenever the mouse hovers over the image. Now, because we're hovering, it's not going to be the click event, which is why I gave you the documentation here. Feel free to go check that out. And with that, I'll pass it over to you to finish this challenge.
In the documentation, we can see that there is an event called onMouseOver, and there's also onMouseEnter. Either of these would have worked just fine for this challenge. Let's clean up this challenge text so we
The first 100 grand was the richest I have ever felt. To this day, I remember pulling up our bank account and there was 100 grand in it. Hey babe, like check this out. And I just like showed it to her because I was getting choked up. And right after I said that, I was like, babe, like, we can fuck up for 3 years and be okay. For anyone who's broke right now, you probably know what your burn rate is. And I was like, 30 grand a year. I was like, both of us together, we're good. Can't lose now. I was like, we got 3 years to run with. I think about that a lot because I'm like, I wonder why did I feel so rich in that moment? And I think it's because the relative change in wealth was so extreme. If you have $1,000 in bank account and you go to $100,000, you're 100 times richer. I mean, for everyone who's listening, like, I was broke up to this point.
declutter a little bit. And I'll go ahead first and create my function here. We'll say handle mouse over. And then on my image, I can add an on mouse, capital M, over, capital O, equals, and then my function of handle mouse over. Let's have this console log I was hovered. Let's hit save and cross our fingers. And sure enough, when we hover over the image, we get I was hovered. We can do that really fast and get lots of console logs. Awesome. It can be kind of fun to check out all the different events that you're able to respond to. I think a lot of them you likely haven't even heard of and could probably find some really cool ways to use them. So feel free to poke around the documentation for the different handler functions. This site will take you to the section on mouse event handlers, but if you were to scroll up or down, you would either of these would have worked just fine for was hovered. We can do that really fast and get lots of console logs. Awesome. It can be kind of fun to check out all the different events that you're able to respond to. I think a lot of them you likely haven't even heard of and could probably find some really cool ways to use them. So feel free to poke around the documentation for the different handler functions. This site will take you to the section on mouse event handlers, but if you were to scroll up or down, you would see other ones like touch event handlers and pointer event handlers, keyboard event handlers, and so forth. So lots of really cool stuff there. Hopefully this is fairly straightforward enough. We're going to be doing a lot of event handling. It's one of the cruxes of having a web application over just something that's purely. As we just discussed, when our users first come to our app, they're going to be presented with a pretty simplistic UI, and their task is to type in an ingredient and click Add Ingredient. When they start adding ingredients, they're going to be presented with a new section of the site, which will list the ingredients that they've entered out for them. If you think critically back on what we learned in the last section, you might recognize that what essentially we're going to be doing is adding the ingredients that the user is submitting through this form to an array, and then we'll be mapping over that array to display a list item for every item in the array. So with that in mind, I've set up a bit of a review challenge. I created an array of ingredients, and I want you to, as part of your challenge, map over this list of ingredients and then render them as list items. I've added a little unordered list. It's going to be completely unstyled, but you can render your array of list items right here. As a quick note, if you are already a little bit familiar with React, you will recognize that we're doing this in a weird way. I wanted to point that out now so nobody got confused as to why I was teaching it this way. By the end of this lesson, we're going to see the limitation we have. But for now, don't worry about that, and I'll hand it over to you to work on this review challenge.
go ahead and create a new variable. Let's call it maybe ingredients list, maybe ingredients list items, just to be really explicit. And we'll set that equal to the array that comes back by calling ingredients.map. For each ingredient, which is just going to be a bare string, I will return, and I'm going to use a set of parentheses here so I can take advantage of the implicit return with arrow functions. I'm going to return a list item, and I can just put the ingredients directly inside there because it's just a string. For now, I am going to add my key because I know I'm going to get a warning, so I'll make sure to add the ingredient. Later, when we actually do this, we will figure out a way to make sure that ingredients are unique in our array. Okay, so I'll take my ingredients list items and render them right here like it tells me to do. Let's hit save, and awesome. Our ingredients are showing up. Let's clean this up. Well, we just learned about event listeners, so I have another challenge for you. I'm throwing a little bit of a curveball here because in the last lesson, we only really practiced with mouse events, the on mouse over and the on click events. But between me giving you the exact event handler name and exactly where to put it on the form, I think you'll be able to figure this one out. So your task is to add an on submit to the form element and have the function, which you can define right here, simply console log form submitted for now. All right, let's get cracking. I'll go ahead and create the function first. We'll call it the I'll go ahead and create the function first. We'll call it the handle submit function. It's going to console log form submitted, and I can add the on submit handler to my form, and we'll set it equal to handle submit. This is tangential, but you might be asking, why are we doing a handle submit on the form instead of a handle click on the button? I'd say there's at least a couple reasons. Primarily, it feels more semantic. We're submitting a form. We've created an actual form element, and clicking the button will submit the form. So what we should be doing is handling the submission of the form. Maybe more importantly, if a user hits enter in the input, well, that's not going to trigger a button click event. However, it will trigger a form on submit event. And so for free, we essentially get the capability to type into the input and hit return or enter without having to handle a separate event on the input. We haven't really done anything to handle the text that's in here, so it doesn't matter what's there. I'll go ahead and click, well, I have to save first. I'll type in here, I'll click add ingredient, and awesome, we get form submitted. We also can type in here and hit enter, and sure enough, we get form submitted. Now, later on in the section, we are going to do a much deeper dive on forms. So there's going to be a couple things that I add to my handle submit. I'll explain them briefly, but especially if you're not familiar with how forms natively work on the web, I'm really not expecting you to memorize this stuff right now. For now, let's start by cleaning up this challenge text to buy ourselves some room. And the first thing that I actually forgot to put on my input is a name property. Whenever we're submitting a form, our inputs all need to have a name. We'll see why in just a second, but I'm going to call this ingredient. Secondly, when I submitted my form, you might have noticed that the form actually refreshed the page. And now that we have a name on our input, we can actually see a URL change. If I were to say, I don't know, cumin, I'll hit enter, and sure enough, the page refreshed. And if you look up in the little mini browser URL, you'll see that it says ingredient equals cumin. This has to do with the way that forms natively submit on the web. However, in our modern framework of React, we actually don't currently want this page to do a full refresh. And so I can prevent that from happening by grabbing the event that is passed to my handle submit function and calling event.preventDefault. Let me hit save and put this back to just a slash. We'll go ahead and I can just say testing and hit enter. And awesome, our form didn't refresh, our URL didn't change, and we did get our form submitted running. Awesome. Okay, in order for us to do the next challenge, which is hopefully going to drive home the point that I'm trying to make in this lesson, I'm going to do a little bit of hand-waving coding. Again, if you're not familiar with this and it doesn't make sense, it's completely okay. Please don't be too concerned about it. My goal is to have you do a challenge where you take the ingredient that was typed into the input and try to add it to the ingredients list. In order to grab the text of the ingredient that the user put into the input box and submitted with the form, I need to grab that through form. data. I can grab that form data on the form itself, and I can access the form DOM element itself through the event that was run when the handle submit function runs. So I can get the form data by creating a new instance of form data and passing the event.currentTarget. Then I can get the ingredient, so let's call it the new ingredient, by calling formData.get and then passing in the name, which is ingredient. This is the name of the input from my form. Let's go ahead and just console log new ingredient. We'll hit save. We'll type testing, hit enter, and check it out. We got our form submitted, of course. We can actually probably get rid of that console log. And we got our new ingredient, which is testing. That's pretty boring. Let's add, I don't know, what's a more exciting ingredient? Let's say jalapenos. Oh, come on, we can get an any in there. Let's do that. Perfect. Okay, jalapenos. Again, this wasn't intended to be something that we actually learned in this lesson, so I went through it really quickly. Please don't be too concerned about it, but do be concerned with your upcoming challenge. Okay, this is the challenge that is really going to drive home the message that I'm trying to get to in this lesson. We have access to our new ingredient. Instead of console logging it, I want you to add it to our array of ingredients. After you've done that, I want you to add a console log of your ingredients because, spoiler alert, what we might be hoping would happen, which is to have the page update with the new item that they added, it's not going to work. Now, this hint says that it's a one-liner solution, so don't overthink it. I guess technically it's 2 lines because I'm also asking you to console log the ingredients. Okay, let's get your hands on the keyboard again and work on this challenge. Okay, so inside of our handle submit, we might be thinking, well, I can just push to the ingredients array the new ingredient. We'll go ahead and, as asked, console log the ingredients array, and let's hit save. We'll put in our jalapenos, add ingredient. Let's look at what we got, and sure enough, it got added to the list. However, and maybe this was a really, really roundabout way to make this point, we clearly have not updated our page. In a more imperative system, like if we were not using React and just building the site with regular JavaScript accessing the DOM properties, we commonly would find ourselves pushing a new ingredient to the list of ingredients, and then either manually adding a new DOM element to our unordered list, or running some kind of function that does this operation, maps over the new updated ingredients list, and pushes all of those elements to the DOM. However, with the declarative nature of React, we don't want to have to do that. We want to be able to just update our data, or the list of ingredients, and have React recognize that change and reflect it on the page for us. So that's the ultimate goal. I know this was kind of long, but trust me, what we're about to learn is maybe the most important feature that you will learn as a beginner in React. So again, this was a very roundabout way to get to this point, but what we're about to learn, which is the concept of React state, is the key to making all of this work for us. State is one of the most important things that you will learn about React. And so I'm using that fact to justify all of the hoops that I had you jump through in this lesson. So get excited. We are finally about to jump into state and learn how we can harness a major part of the power that React brings to web development. Over my years of teaching React, I found that one of the major confusions stems from not understanding fully the difference between props, which we have talked about in the last section, and state, which we are just now learning about. So I want to spend a little bit of extra time understanding the differences between
I don't know if you guys are hearing me. So actually, I'll make I'll stop the live because I have some other appointment to do today. So I don't know if anyone has a question to ask or something like that. So if you have a question, Rishi is saying that so start making some real project other than completing his tasks. Yeah, it's true. But there's an important point that you have to take note of that is before starting building any real project, you must first of all learn how to do simple project. And when you're learning a new language, sorry, more precisely a new library, first start with simple stuff. So that's basically why these Scrimba stuff, these tutorials have basically easy projects. So when you learn how to do those stuff, then you can easily build real world project. But there's no problem. I'm also interested because I have started doing such things. So if you just get to join the Discord community, we can discuss more about it. So, do anyone has another question or something else like that? Because I will end the live at 4:25. So, I would like to say thank you guys for watching. I'm just looking at my statistics nowadays. We got up to 300 approved views and 11 likes. So thank you, thank you. We shall meet on another day to continue with the life. And that being said, let us stay hard.